I open this public session of the doctoral committee of the Faculty of Theology with the votum. Our help is in the name of the Lord, who has made heaven and earth. Prior to the examination, I invite a candidate to give a brief explanation of the research on which her thesis is based.
Good morning, Rector, the Doctoral Examination Committee, professors, families, and friends. I think most of us had heard of or even familiar with the song title, Que sera, sera, especially with the part which says, Que sera, sera, wherever will be, will be. The future is not ours to see. Que sera, sera, what will be, will be. Like many products of our popular culture, this song seems to imply certain message. It seems to suggest the message that what will be actually must be, an expression that our future is already determined and fixed. Many Christians believe that the Bible displays a God who knows the future, and everything that happens are in accordance with his preordained decree. At the same time, Christians also believe that humans have freedom. A problem or tension that seems to appear in these two beliefs is, if God knows, controls, and ordains everything, how can humans be free and how can human choices be real? Or, if everything is what will be, and what will be, must be, do we or can we obtain human freedom? Throughout the centuries, many solutions have been proposed by Christian theologians and philosophers in attempting to reconcile the two claims. One of these solutions focuses on the theory of middle knowledge, which is proposed by the Spanish Jesuit Luis de Molina. According to this theory, God knows what any human being would freely do given a set of conditions X, Y, and Z. And through his middle knowledge, God knows what every individual would freely do in every possible situation. God then can choose and manage the conditions that apply in such a way that his providential plans are realized without human freedom being compromised. Apart from a wealth of philosophical consideration, the appeal to biblical text also plays an important role in the foundation of this theory. However, whereas the philosophical ramifications of this theory have been widely discussed in contemporary scholarly literature during the past decades, surprisingly little attention has been given to its use of biblical texts. My research aimed at filling this gap by critically examining the attempts to defend or criticize the theory of middle knowledge with reference to the Bible. Considering that in the course of the discussion, Molina, Herman Bavinck, and William Craig have made influential contributions to the discussion on middle knowledge, in 3 separate chapters, namely chapter 2 to 4, I examining the writings of Molina, Bavinck, and Craig on the topic of middle knowledge, with special attention given to the role of the Bible in their arguments. I also investigated their interpretation and understanding of these 6 biblical texts that is shown on the screen now, which they have cited in their discussion on middle knowledge. In order to achieve a more definite ground for a systematic and theological evaluation of and reflection on these scriptural texts cited by them, in chapter 5, I concentrate on the works of Brewer Charles, whom is an Old Testament scholar, and Anthony Tilston, a New Testament scholar. Taking into account how Charles and Tilston approached the Bible, I proposed a framework for a possible theological appropriation of the Bible. In this framework, I listed out 5 conditions or 5 lenses which we can study and interpret the Bible theologically. I then perform a theological reading an interpretation of the 6 biblical passages cited by Molina, Bowing, and Craig with my proposed framework. I then have come to the conclusion that the theological scope of the first 4 passages is about the absolute mightiness of God. This passage speaks about God's divine sovereignty, power, and deliverance. In line with this, I argue that although these 4 passages indicated God's knowledge and will, they are associated with God's presence and ability, His saving grace and deliverance act. In other words, the indication of God's foreknowledge in this text point to God's benevolent power and action, rather than to how much God knows. As about the last 2 passages, I argue that they are not the biblical evidence of middle knowledge. I also concluded that to accept the theory of middle knowledge leads to sacrificing and downplaying the overall biblical and theological account of God. Lastly, I pointed out that in considering my proposed framework that is sketched in light of Charles and Chesterton approaches, we are being reminded that if we are to understand God's knowledge and its relation to human freedom, we must turn to the Scripture, not as finding support for the intention or will we concluded from other fields or discipline, but as the starting and ending point of our question and answer. We need to explore a framework where we can learn to know who God is and His way with humankind, as well as to investigate the tension between foreknowledge and freedom theologically and exegetically, so that we may deal and live with the tension between foreknowledge and freedom through a more hermeneutical and theological responsible approach. Thank you.
Thank you for this introduction. May I hear from the candidate that she's prepared to defend her thesis?
Rector, on your authority and as authorized by the College of Deans, and in accordance with the Doctoral Examination Committee in the Faculty of Theology, I am prepared to defend my thesis entitled, You Know It Completely, The Concept of Middle Knowledge and Biblical Interpretation in Louis D. Molina, Herman Bowing, and William Lane Craig, in order to obtain the degree of doctor.
Thank you. Well, we don't know yet completely, but some opponents are going to ask you some questions. And the first to start a discussion with you is Professor Jan Hoek. He's a professor systematic theology at the Evangelical Theological Faculty in Leuven in Belgium, and he's professor of Reformed Spirituality at the Protestant Theological University in Groningen. Dr. Hoek, we are very pleased with your presence here. Thank you for starting the discussion with the candidate. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Rector. Esteemed candidate, on the authority of the Rector Magnificus and according to the right given to me, I appreciate to discuss with you about the way Herman Bavink is evaluated in your dissertation. Let me first say that I enjoyed reading your careful analysis of debates concerning the concept of middle knowledge and the hermeneutical questions involved in this debate. I welcome your book as a good contribution to the actual endeavors to stimulate a fruitful dialogue and cooperation between the disciplines of biblical theology and systematic theology. I appreciate your correct and clear delineation of the positions of Molina, Bavink, and Craig, and also the succinct overview of the insights of Childs and Chesterton. So I congratulate you with your stimulating book. Questions always remain, of course, and there is always more work to do. The question I wish to raise in this discussion regards, as I already mentioned, your evaluation of the theological position of Herman Bavink. This evaluation is not totally clear to me. In general, you are very positive about him, and more especially, you follow him to a large extent in his view upon scientia media. Nevertheless, you make some critical comments regarding his use of the Bible. Here is the focus of my question. It is not totally clear to me what is the specific gravity of your criticism. Must I see this as a marginal comment or as a fundamental objection? Sometimes I think you have fundamental objections indeed, like at page 127, where you conclude that Molina, Craig, and Bavink all together treat the Bible, I quote, in coalition with their system, they bring their horizon into the Bible. In other words, they explain the Bible through the lens of their own horizon instead of encountering the horizon of the Bible, unquote. At this point, I understand that you advocate an alternative approach. We have, I quote, to recognize the urgent and important need to meet the otherness of the biblical text in order to grasp the text's biblical theological message, unquote. But at the other hand, you give Bavink the credits that his concern was to unfold and preserve biblical truth of how foreknowledge and freedom are revealed in the Scripture. Page 126. In this connection, your criticism is very mild. I quote, Bavink's argument against middle knowledge would be even more convincing if he were to show a more in-depth study of the theological message of the scriptural texts he used and employ a less Aristotelian method in his approach. Even more convincing. So just a little bit more of what is already sound and good. Can you explain me this seemingly ambivalent evaluation of Bavink, and can you make clear to me how fundamental or how marginal your criticism on Bavink really is? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for your kind comments and questions. I think, as I try to show in chapter 3, the way how Bavink began his whole discussion of divine foreknowledge and middle knowledge by beginning actually from the biblical text that it is used by the Reformed tradition or the Reformed Orthodox. I think, as I show in chapter 3, that the way he used this text and the way he explained this text is actually very closely to the Reformed Orthodox and the Reformed theology. But on the other hand, it also seems that it's quite clear, it is also commented by some other scholar, that Bavink stands on the shoulder of Augustine, and he, though he began with scripture, but the structure of Augustine theology actually shaped or become the groundwork of his work. And that's what I pointed out in the last chapter in my conclusion, that if the exegetical part of Bavink, or if how he explained foreknowledge of God and human freedom through a more biblical approach, in the sense that he explained the text more, for instance, like what I am trying to do in my work, the consultation of different biblical scholar, then it will be even more convincing that he's not only following the tradition of Reformed Orthodox, which the debate actually in the 16th century, the Reformed Orthodox already have a great debate with Molina and the Molinism. So it will be more convincing if the part of his hermeneutical part can be broader or stronger instead of following the scholasticism or Augustinian theology. So I think, of course, to me, Bavink part of explaining divine foreknowledge and freedom is convincing, but it will be more convincing if he can consult a broader biblical perspective.
Thank you for your clear answer. It sounds to me like a mild and a marginal criticism. And may I ask, to what extent will your own view on middle knowledge differ from the view of Herman Bavink?
My own view. I think middle knowledge actually has its strength. Actually, why I study middle knowledge, because at first when I was introduced by my colleagues about middle knowledge, I found it so promising and a good way to solve the problem of divine sovereignty and human freedom. So I think there is a strength in it. I think Bowing seems to, not to downplay, but his criticism is strong and is totally out of his picture that middle knowledge can play no part for us in understanding God knowledge and freedom. I think I will leave some space for that, and I will also continue to hopefully find some answer for the criticism of middle knowledge, especially what has been discussed in contemporary discussion, the metaphysics, the grounding of future contingency, the whole debate about this, that what middle knowledge is talking about, the possibility of something never happened actually does not have truth value. I think though this has been debated for a long time, almost 30 to 40 years, and it seems to stop the debate, but I think there are still some space that maybe we can try to understand about it and to have more space and to open the discussion instead of closing it.
Okay, then second opponent will be Dr. Harm Goris. He is Associate Professor of Systematic Theology at the School of Catholic Theology at Tilburg University. Dr. Goris, we are pleased by your attendance of this public defense of the thesis of Ms. Chiew. Thank you for being here. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Rector. Esteemed candidate, on the authority of the Rector Magnificus and in accordance with the right given to me, I would like to ask you the following question. In your thesis, you dismiss the theory of middle knowledge both on systematical conceptual grounds, for you suggest that internally it's not coherent logically, but also on biblical grounds. And as regards the latter, you offer two biblical arguments for refuting the theory of middle knowledge. The first argument is that that middle knowledge is not found in the Bible. You argue that specific biblical passages that proponents of the theory have used to show that the Bible asserts that God has knowledge of counterfactuals of freedom, that these passages should be interpreted differently. You argue, you mentioned it also in your talk earlier, that these biblical passages are not about middle knowledge, but about God's providence or sovereignty, or they serve only to urge people to change their lives. Mm-hmm. The second biblical argument you have against the theory of middle knowledge is that you say that the theory is incompatible with core doctrines in the Bible. You argue that the theory of middle knowledge contradicts God's sovereignty as attested in Scripture. However, behind these two specific biblical counter-arguments, you think that there is an even more fundamental error in the very method of the proponents of middle knowledge. For, as you say, and you mentioned it also in your talk, these proponents of the theory of middle knowledge, they bring their own horizon into the Bible. On page 127, you write, they, that's the proponents of theory of middle knowledge, they explain the Bible through the lens of their own horizon instead of encountering the horizon of the Bible. And on that same page, you specify the horizon that they bring into as philosophy, and even more precisely as metaphysics. However, I don't think that that is what the proponents of the theory of middle knowledge are actually doing. Most of them will say that they raise logical questions, and that the theory of middle knowledge is first of all a logical theory about conceptual analysis and about the coherence of different propositions, in particular the coherence of the proposition God foreknows the whole future and the proposition that human beings are free. That middle knowledge is about logic, you also acknowledge yourself in the very beginning of your thesis on pages 5 and 6, where you agree with Fred Verdozo and Bill Hasker that logical coherence is the main problem. Now, logical questions are by themselves neutral with regard to specific metaphysical or ontological claims. So I would argue that it is not philosophy in general, let alone specific metaphysical theories, that the proponents of middle knowledge bring into the Bible, but the only thing that they bring into the Bible is rather innocent logic. So middle knowledge, I think, is a way to interpret Scripture and to solve one of its apparent contradictions, the apparent contradiction of God foreknows the whole future and human beings are free. So if middle knowledge is merely a logical and not a metaphysical theory, then there is no fundamental a priori reason why it may not be brought into the discussion when we try to interpret Scripture. You yourself, you see no problem in bringing in literary or philological or historical arguments when we interpret Scripture. So, in conclusion, I think that the more fundamental basic criticism that you have against the very method of middle knowledge is not justified. Middle knowledge may turn out to be false, okay, for logical reasons, but that does not mean that it is theological or biblically illegal beforehand. So my question is, are you willing to give up, in view of my comments, are you willing to give up your fundamental theological argument against the theory of middle knowledge?
Thank you very much for your questions. Certainly, I will not give up my position for middle knowledge. I have to defend it. I think your questions is related to a broader perspective of how we approach issue about God, or how we know God or understand the truth of God. If we look from how Charles and Chesterton understand the Bible, especially Charles, he emphasized a lot that Scripture is a witness to the divine truth. And also Cabal says that if we want to unfold the truth about God, we have to start from the Bible. And that's why it's become a great concern for me. If we want to prove that middle knowledge is a way for us to solve the tension between foreknowledge and freedom, we have to find some evidence from the Bible, because the whole questions of the tension between foreknowledge and freedom arise from our questions and search about God and His knowledge, and also its relation with human freedom. And I think Chesterton quote Bonhoeffer in a very good way when he says that when we come to the otherness or the horizon of the Bible, actually we are to encounter the subject rather than to master an object. I think this is how we approach the Bible. It is not to find or to put our own answer into the Bible or our own system, but to see actually what the Bible revealed to us. And that's why I try to study from Charles and Chesterton way, the canonical approach of Charles, and also the way Chesterton approached the Bible, to give us actually some ground or some framework, then actually we can approach the Bible. I certainly would not say that I offer the best answer, but I hope that it gives us more exploration and also from a different direction to approach this problem. I think my main argument is if our desire is to know about God, we have to search the Bible, because this is the way how God revealed Himself to us. And we cannot find evidence of middle knowledge in the Bible. And that's why I will hold to my position that I will not give up, that middle knowledge is an acceptable theological biblical theory.
So if I understand you correctly, that you say, well, the very project, it is a good question, or it is a legitimate question to ask if God has middle knowledge, yes or no. We may ask that question, and we may read the Bible to find an answer to that. So you would agree that it is a legitimate question to
Yes,
ask
it is.
to Scripture.
It is a legitimate
okay,
question.
and then it maybe turn out afterwards that Scripture says no, God
Yep.
does not have that kind of
Yes.
knowledge. But okay, good. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for your question. The next opponent is Dr. Wido van Peursen. He's professor of Old Testament at this faculty of theology at the VU University. Van Peursen, the floor is yours.
Esteemed candidate, on the authority of Director Magnificus and in accordance with the right given to me, I would like to ask you a question. But first, let me say that as a biblical scholar, I am pleased with the role of biblical theology in your argument. Your thesis can be read as a rehabilitation of biblical theology in systematic theology, as a rejection of the use or misuse of biblical text to support a philosophical argument, and as a strong call to go back to the scriptures to see what particular passages tell us from their own context. In the case of middle knowledge, you, according to me, convincingly show that the advocates of middle knowledge have used some biblical passages as proof texts which, on a closer inspection, cannot function as such. The question that these biblical passages answer is not about the nature of God's knowledge, but about the way about God's benevolent power and action. When you describe the differences between Molina's use of the Bible and the Reformed tradition, on page 56, you say that in Molina's case, quote, biblical texts are used to support the presuppositions and propositions he derived from philosophical analysis. You argue that the Reformed tradition, with its emphasis on divine omnipotence and omniscience, does more justice to the Bible than Molina's view, because it gives priority to God's revelation in Scripture over philosophical analytical thinking. But here starts my question. Does the Reformed systematic reflection about God indeed more justice to the full scriptural revelation? Is it indeed less analytical? I read in your thesis, in your refutation of William Gregg's analytical approach, if God has middle knowledge, then his knowledge, including his power, is limited, but this perspective contradicts the scriptural indication of divine omnipotence and divine omniscience. This sounds also a bit analytical. Moreover, why does the scriptural indication of divine omnipotence and divine omniscience have priority over other scriptural indications? The God of the Bible is also the one who says, perhaps they will listen and each will turn from the evil ways. Then I will relent and not inflict on them the disaster I was planning because of the evil they have done. Jeremiah 26:3. The God of the Bible is the God who is eager to know whether there is but one person in Jerusalem who is righteous, and then he will forgive the city. Jeremiah 5:1. He is the God who seeks out a man after his own heart to replace King Saul. 1 Samuel 13:14. How do you deal with the dissident voices that can be heard in the Bible? Why should a God who knows everything use the word perhaps? And who should he be seeking? Are these passages that I just quoted silenced because of the presupposition that the canon provides a coherent picture of God and that these passages do not fit in? How do you avoid that you start with the God of the Church Fathers or the God of the Reformed tradition rather than with the multiple voices that can be heard in the Bible?
Thank you very much for your questions. Actually, I do agree that for many passages, there are multiple meaning and multiple voices, and we can interpret it in many ways. But if you look at the scripture that about divine foreknowledge, especially divine foreknowledge, I think we can find, especially for the example that I've shown in my work, the four first passages that Molina and Bowing used to support their views. actually we can find quite, I would not say unified, but the same understanding or same interpretation of this text from scholar since early church father until contemporary scholar. I would say that actually about divine foreknowledge, about divine omniscience, doctrine on this, we can find quite a close or quite a similar understanding and interpretation of this text. Of course, the text that you quote just now, this is always the difficult part that when we deal with divine foreknowledge and human freedom, there are always scripture that seems to suggest the other way. I mean, the conclusion different than what I say. But I would argue that, as I also try to emphasize and stress in my work, that how we understand God, how we interpret certain passages, text, has to be coherent with the overall Bible, the overall picture about God in the Bible. Let's say, for instance, about God's knowledge. I think the Reformed exegesis provide us some good ground to understand this because they begin the whole discussion about divine foreknowledge from the nature of God, who He is. If He is God who has full knowledge of Himself, He has full knowledge of His creation. And in Him there's full of light, He knows everything. And it is shown that and also identified that God knows everything. So even though there are other passages who seems to suggest some other answer, but I think the conclusion that we derive or the conclusion that how we interpret this scripture has to be coherent with the overall picture of how God is displayed in the Bible. And that is also why I try to study from Charles and Chesterton. Hopefully we can get some framework that can guide us or give us some lens, at least some direction, how we should approach this problem. Instead of focusing on text that seems to be contradicted, maybe we can step one step back and see through this through some lenses or a framework that can offer us some, not to say solution, but some way out or different approach to how we understand this scripture.
Well, thank you for your answer. So, if you say, well, you agree with the Reformed tradition that they start with God's knowledge and
His nature.
His nature. So, do you have any? Can you give me a perspective apart from the middle knowledge that you discuss in this dissertation? What the approach that you advocate will modify the view on the nature of God's knowledge compared with Reformed systematic theology? So where will your approach lead to?
I think that's what I try to do in my work, is to propose a framework for a theological appropriation of the Bible, and that's what I try to do when I propose this framework. I try to return to the scripture again and see that how they bring us different answers if we look through or interpret or understand this scripture to the framework that I propose, especially through the study of Charles and Chesterton, to deriving some insight or understanding from their work. Maybe we come, like what I have tried to show, that I came up with a framework that hopefully through this framework, when we look at this scripture, that we might interpret it or understand it in a different way.
Is that specific enough as answer to your question?
I think for the moment.
Satisfied for the moment? No other questions?
It's a bit on the time that is left. I see.
There's still some time. So.
Okay. So I understand your method, and that's also what you clearly illustrate in your book. But then, can you give an example how our view of the nature of God's knowledge, how our view on that or our formulation of that will may be affected by your approach, by the priority given to the biblical testimony?
As I have shown in my work, especially in the conclusion chapter, usually when we approach scripture like Psalm 139 or Hebrew 4:13, we used to focus on the description there, especially when they say we are exposed to God, everything that we have in mind, or the words before we say God knows it. We focus on saying that this is an indication of divine foreknowledge. But when we try to read through the proposed framework, we can actually have a broader perspective in understanding this scripture actually talks about our relationship with God. It's about our personal relationship with God. So when we read through it, although there are certain indications of God's foreknowledge, but our focus is not so much about how much God knows or how it can solve the tension between foreknowledge and our human freedom, but rather we are draw near to Him, to worship Him, and to understand our position before Him, knowing that He is the Creator and we are the creation. And we are to draw near to Him, to understand Him, and learn to obey to His word. So I think this is a way that try to change the pattern of dealing with the tension of divine foreknowledge and human freedom. When we approach these questions, we know that there are tension, but we are even drawn nearer to Him, to try to learn to obey His work and worship Him, understand our position before Him, who we are and who He is.
Well, I'm very satisfied for the moment. Yes.
Thank you, and thank you for your answer as well, for the discussion. We continue now with the next opponent. It's Dr. Ari Sweep. He's Associate Professor of New Testament and Hermeneutics. Dr. Sweep, very welcome at this opposition. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Redker. Esteemed candidate, on the authority of the Rector Magnificus and in accordance with my rights given to me, I would like to bring in a typical hermeneutical question. I will concentrate on your treatment of the work of Anthony Thistleton, especially with regard to his notion of questions that arise as an incentive for theological interpretation. You refer to this notion on page 105 and elsewhere. Let me say in advance that I've read your work with great interest, and I applaud your courage to argue for a biblical theological turn. But what are the implications? And will it work? I see some bears along the way, if not a dead-end street. You may be well aware that the notion of questions that arise does not come from Thistleton himself. The distinction and perhaps antithesis between questions that arise and problems, abstract problems, comes from Gadamer, who in turn took it from R.G. Collingwood, the British historian of philosophy. In short, questions that arise are intrinsic to the reading experience. They are part of the question and answer dialectic. Abstract problems are extrinsic. They come from elsewhere, so to speak. This is a bit overgeneralized, of course, but helpful enough for now. Both types of questions have their own currency and their own legitimacy, but they do represent two different approaches with two different outcomes. Both Gadamer and Thistleton give high priority to questions that arise. From the cited pages of your work and your final chapters, I have the impression that you understand or want to understand the whole debate on foreknowledge, freedom and middle knowledge as belonging to the domain of questions that arise rather than to the domain of abstract problems. And you can correct me if I'm wrong. If so, the turn to biblical theology makes sense, at least at first sight. But I understand the debate on middle knowledge, and perhaps that on foreknowledge and freedom as well, as typical an example of an abstract problem as you will ever get in this earthly life. And both Gadamer and Thistleton consider abstract problems as less productive, their term, perhaps unanswerable, insoluble, Gadamer's term, or worse in terms of speech act theory, misfires, comparable to the question what the time on the sun is. If you take the whole debate as a question that arises, however, you may run into big trouble in the course of your biblical theological argument. In the biblical writings, God's existence is always taken for granted. Granted, perhaps in the most literal sense of the word, but not proved. God's foreknowledge, his omnipotence and omniscience are acclaimed, confessed, denied, struggled with, experienced, if you like, but never objects of a rational argument. It is never an abstract problem. To complicate matters a bit, though, strictly speaking, all the relevant biblical text you cite prove no more than that certain authors held certain convictions about certain aspects or attributes of the divinity. They are, in my view, the result of questions that arise. Yes, very much so. They are existential questions. Questions arising from life, from the stream of life, but they result in answers that defy systemization. At least that's what I like to think. So here's the dilemma. If you approach the issue of middle knowledge as a question that arises, your turn to biblical theology is most unlikely to lead to a unified biblical theology. Page 118, your words, a unified biblical theology. We hear a variety of voices in Scripture. But if you treat it as an abstract problem, you're called to take the Bible as the beginning and ending of knowledge of God. Page 113, again, your words, the ending of knowledge of God. Then it becomes a straitjacket that effectively impairs an open dialogue. Unfortunately, you do not demonstrate in your work how such a biblical theological perspective on foreknowledge and freedom would look like in practice. In chapter 6, you announce such a program, but you do not carry it out. So, here's my question. What makes you believe that the turn to biblical theology, with the help of Thistleton, is not a dead-end street? Needless to say that I'm looking forward to your response.
I think the whole purpose or whole intention of my work is because, as the first place, Molina and Craig use biblical passages to support their view. And they say that there is biblical evidence of middle knowledge. And that's why my search for the answer began. I hope to understand from the text that they cited whether there is indication of middle knowledge, or is it as how they explain divine foreknowledge of future contingents. And because there are also works or also dialogue or communication between scholars from different fields who try to deal with this problem, as I also briefly pointed out in especially chapter 1 and chapter 2. Voices or communication or discussion are generated from people from different fields about the biblical usage of Molina and Craig. But most of the time, they don't come to a consensus, or they cannot come to an agreement, because they approach this text from different angle, or maybe I say different tradition, different exegetical method. So the discussion always ends up with those who hold their own views will remain in their own camps, and there's not much progress that seems to move on. So what I was trying to do is, especially this part is, as what I also show in my work, that little attention has been given to the hermeneutical and or biblical evaluation of middle knowledge. So I hope to participate or contribute to this discussion, and also move the discussion forward a bit by some scholars who offer authoritative voices in biblical study. Hence, we decided to study Charles and Thistleton, because they are both one of the main authoritative voices in Old Testament study and New Testament. And the role of Thistleton play is not so much about his philosophical hermeneutical insight, but more on the awareness that he brought to us, especially we should approach the Bible and our own views with presupposition. We have to know that the awareness of the horizon of the Bible and our own horizon. And I think that bring a great differences in my work than other works is because we are called to the awareness and also the thought that probably maybe even Bowing or Molina and Craig, they approach the Bible with their own horizon and with their presupposition. And the way that Thistleton brought the whole change of how we approach the Bible contributes to my work in this way. So it's more on bringing the awareness of approaching the Bible, acknowledging that it is a different horizon with us, and we have our own presupposition. And that's what I'm also trying to show from Molina and Craig. As I've shown in chapter 2 and chapter 4, although most of the time they try to begin the whole discussion of divine foreknowledge from biblical texts, but when they talk about its relationship with human freedom, they change to an analytical aspect. It seems that there are no biblical texts that can offer us an answer. So I would like to point out that maybe, perhaps, they approach the Bible still with their own horizon, and they haven't met the otherness of the Bible in such a way.
Okay, well, that explains a lot as far as the topic of middle knowledge is concerned. But I also hinted at the whole debate on foreknowledge and freedom, and your, let me say, escape to biblical texts. What gives you the idea that we could solve the debate about it, or can't we?
No, as I pointed out in the beginning and at the ending, actually, I don't think we can offer a rational answer to solve the tension. And that's not my intention at all. I don't think we can solve the tension, and that's what my purpose. I want to show our limitation on this. We cannot solve the problem, especially by through a philosophical exclusively approach. And if we are to understand it, is to deal with it and live with it, live with the tension. I don't think we can solve it rationally.
But you are pointing us to Scripture, to go back to the sources and so on, to do good study on exegetical study on Scriptures. But for me, that's a bit of an enigma, because when I study these texts, I hear these different voices. Let me put it otherwise. How must I, as a biblical scholar, make the transition from a merely descriptive reading of text, a historical reading of text, or an exegetical reading of text, as you like, to the transition to a full-blown theological assessment without compromising the public nature of biblical studies and theology, and at the same time acknowledge it as a faith document that somehow plays a role in divine discourse. I find this a problem unsolved in your paper. So you point us in this direction. So you announce we should now take up our Bibles and find the answers. But what will the outcome be? So you mention only some specific texts in response to what other scholars have done. But where is your own program, so to speak? Your biblical, theological program, your method?
My method will be the proposed framework that I try to work out, the 5 lenses or the 5 parameters that we can try to approach to understand the Bible biblically and theologically, become an overarching framework that we can understand this framework through a theological...
Would you agree with me that the term framework is somewhat like abstract problem?
In certain extent, yes.
Okay. So then you try to solve this biblical theological question not through the way of questions that arise, but through an abstract problem.
No, in that way, no, I wouldn't say that. But actually what my intention is trying to show that there is a limitation if we try to solve it in an abstract way. There is a huge difficulties, and that's why the whole discussion of middle knowledge is for 40 years, and they didn't much progress in the discussion because they focus on the abstract and philosophical aspect of it.
But the same goes for the discussion on freedom and divine foreknowledge, which lasts for 2,000 years already.
Yes. That's why I'm not. I've mentioned in the beginning that I'm not trying to solve the tension, and I don't think it can be solved.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you both for the interesting dialogue and helping us to clarify the issue. We continue with the last opponent. That's Dr. Maarten Wisse. He's Associate Professor of Systematic Theology at this faculty, VU University Amsterdam. Colleague, the floor is yours.
Thank you for the word, Rector. Esteemed candidate, on the authority of Director Magnificus and in accordance with the rights given to me, I would like to ask you some questions about your dissertation. But before doing this, I would like to congratulate you with the dissertation. You have brought together various, very different fields. One example, for example, you bring together the field of analytic philosophical theology and the field of biblical theology. We have heard about this. But also the field of Anglo-Saxon philosophical theology and the world of Herman Bavinck. I think that's very ambitious, and you have succeeded in bringing together in this dissertation. I would like to discuss a few questions with you about the dissertation. As a first question, I would like to go to page 126. And this is about the middle of the page, where you state the following. For example, that's almost the end of the paragraph. For example, in order to hold 1 Samuel 23, 6-13, and Matthew 11, 20-24 as direct indications of middle knowledge, Molina and Craig have to give up the doctrine of divine omniscience that the theory of middle knowledge asserts. And then you say after that, see chapter 2.4.1 and chapter 4.6.2. This puzzled me, this quite direct statement that Molina and Craig have to give up the doctrine of the divine omniscience. And so I went back to those two subsections that you mentioned in order to check what you said there exactly. And I must say I didn't find the statement there. So, and once more, I'm afraid that I have to disagree with you on your statement, because I don't think Molina and Craig have the intention, nor do they actually give up divine omniscience. Because as I understand middle knowledge, it is something in between. And it is something in between God having knowledge of every possibility in not only in the actual reality, but in all possible realities. And then the other side of the in-between is God's actual decision of what will become the actual world. And in between is God's knowledge of what would happen if people, under certain conditions, make use of their human freedom, their genuinely free decision. So what you suggest is that Molina and Craig, by opting for this moment in the middle, give up divine omniscience, but after this middle knowledge, the divine decree follows, where God actually chooses that this which would happen under these conditions will certainly happen. So in the end, God has absolutely certain knowledge of future contingents. So my question is, why do you state that Molina and Craig have to give up divine omniscience on the conditions of this theory?
Thank you for giving me the chance to actually clarify the statement here. Actually, what I'm trying to say that certainly Molina and Craig, they hold strongly to saying that God has divine foreknowledge, and divine omniscience is something that they would certainly want to hold to. What I'm trying to say that instead of doing that, their whole theory actually do the other thing. It come out to the opposite results, that actually God's sovereignty and God's omniscience has to be given up. Because as I pointed out in 2.4.1, according to the whole theory, also just now you have summarized it in a good way, when it says that there are lots of opportunity and God looked at all these possibilities and he picked from one of the possibility that meets his desire and he decreed it. The whole world order is turned around in the sense that it's not like God decides and the world is moved on accordingly, but God looks on how we will do something and only he decides. And divine decree is only appears after middle knowledge. And in such a way, it doesn't seem to uphold divine foreknowledge, because it's not like God knows, but God knows what we will do, and he will pick from what we will do, the possibility, something that matches his plan, and he make that decision. And I think in this way, instead of upholding divine omniscience, they actually give up, because God's decision and God's knowledge is depending on contingent state of affair. It's not God already knew something. It's like God depends on the consequences and the result, the choices of human beings. And in such a way, divine omniscience is given up.
So what you intend to say here in this sentence that I quoted is not that they give up the divine omniscience, but that they give up the traditional view of divine omniscience, where actually things happen because of God's decision.
Yes.
Now, my further question would be why this is true. This is like the standard Reformed objection, and also as you explain in your dissertation, not only of the Reformed but also Roman Catholics who protested against this middle knowledge theory. This is the standard objection, but I'm not convinced of that objection, because what God decides is not what will actually happen. So it's not that God looks around in the actual world and sees, oh, hey, person A is going to choose X at that moment, because the real world is not yet there. What God has is like knowledge of absolute probabilities, but still things that apply under certain conditions. So there is this first step where God only sees possibilities, and there's that decisive extra step where God knows that if a certain condition would obtain, then person X would do this. So, and what God in his wisdom does is that God chooses. God still chooses. So it's still by virtue of God's choosing that a certain world from all these possibilities becomes the actual world. So what God does is choose in his wisdom what we would have chosen in our wisdom, what we actually do choose in our wisdom in the actual world, but which is still because of its initial conditions, because of God's good governance, God's providence in this actual world, which is still certainly God's choice. So what's wrong with that extra step which guarantees our human freedom?
But that step puts divine degree after middle knowledge. It's not like God decree, God preordains, and we move on. It's like God looks on the choices and the results that we will perform, and God pick from that. And I think that's the problem that sacrifices divine sovereignty.
But I'm afraid you're repeating the standard objection now, and I'm still not convinced of that. So I want to push you a little further, because what all the Reformed always admitted was, first, that God knows more than the actual world. So there is a range of possible worlds that God would. So God knows the possibilities.
But what is then different with natural knowledge? Natural knowledge also includes God's knowledge of possibilities, what we could do. So why middle knowledge? Why not natural knowledge, divine decree, and free knowledge? Why we have to insert a middle knowledge in between? Don't you think it's a bit additional? And because of the purpose that we want to attribute human freedom into it, and as it turns out, it actually sacrifices human freedom and also divine foreknowledge. My argument is why we need to put divine middle knowledge in between. Isn't natural knowledge, decree, and free knowledge enough to answer our questions?
I think this is because the knowledge of possibilities only says what could happen, but it doesn't explain why where you, so to speak, go from one possible world to another possible world. There is a possible world where I'm here at this moment. There is another world where I would be at home. The middle knowledge comes in where God has knowledge of genuine freedom, making the difference from one possible world to the other. So you could see it's just a small extension of a form of knowledge of possibilities that God already had according to the Reformed. So it was just making it slightly more plausible, more helpful than the Reformed already suggested.
But don't you think the sacrificial that we have to make is too big, too much? Even to you, it seems like only a one thing, an additional thing, but what you give up is even more. If we attribute this to human freedom, the space of human freedom through middle knowledge, we actually have to give up lots of other scripture that speak about God knowledge. And how are we to reconcile with all this contradiction that even seems to create more tension to me, as I've tried to show in chapter 2.
I'm not so sure of that, because it is still God's choice, so you don't sacrifice God's freedom.
God's
at
choice
all.
depends on our decision. So
No,
it's
it doesn't
different.
depend on. It's just linked to. So it is oriented towards. So God could also choose against our freedom.
I would
He
disagree.
might, but
I would
in his
disagree
wisdom he
that
doesn't.
it is linked to. I don't think it's linked to. It depends on.
I'm still wondering.
Now that my defense has ended, I sincerely thank the opponents for the attention they have devoted to my thesis. I now look forward to the decision of the doctoral examination committee in the Faculty of Theology, which will decide whether the degree of doctor will be granted to me.
I hereby adjourn the public meeting of the Doctoral Examination Committee of the Faculty of Theology for further deliberation. Please take a seat. I hereby reopen the public session of the Doctoral Examination Committee of the Faculty of Theology. And by its duly accorded authority, the Doctoral Examination Committee of the Faculty of Theology grants the degree of doctor to Sze Sze Chiew. The professor who has been appointed as promoter by the College of Deans will now perform the investiture. I invite the supervisors, first of all, to sign the degree certificate as witness of this deed. And by signing, it is said that those who sign declare in public that in the privacy of the closed session of the candidate by his signature stated her adherence to the conditions laid down in the provision in Article 6 of the doctoral regulations of the university. And I quote, "The candidates, the supervisors and the co-supervisors must preserve at all times the norms of scientific integrity as laid down in the Dutch Code of Conduct for Scientific Practice." I now request colleague Van den Brink to resume the ceremony, and during the pronouncement of the investiture formula, only the members of the Doctoral Examination Committee stand.
By the virtue of the authority vested in me by the statute of the Vrije Universiteit, and as a supervisor appointed thereto by the College of Deans, I hereby confer on you, Sze Sze Chiew, the degree of doctor, together with all rights, privileges, and responsibilities thereto appertaining. In witness thereof, the seal of the university and signatures of the rector and the supervisors have been affixed to the diploma you are now about to receive.
I'd like to invite promoter Kees van der Kooi to pronounce the laudatio.
Esteemed Dr. Chiew, dear Sze Sze, it is an honor and a pleasure to address you now by this academic title, Doctor. You have earned it after long years hard working on a subject that is essential to Reformed faith. And therefore, first of all, congratulations with this result. And also with your wonderful defense, because, as you all have heard, she is able to make and to involve, to participate actively in an academic disputation. That was really wonderful. We all were impressed by that. You came from Calvin Theological Seminary before you came to us. And before that, you had already done theological studies in Malaysia. In Calvin Theological Seminary, among others, under the supervision of Professor Karl Bosma, who was also part of the reading committee, and your own supervisor in Malaysia, Professor Ang, was also part of the reading committee. We thank them here also publicly. That you came with us was already more than 6 years ago, I think now about 7 years ago. And in the meantime, you lived periods here in Amsterdam and alternately in your home country, Malaysia. And you belonged to your Chinese church. It has taken perseverance and courage to do and complete this research in a language that, although it is the lingua franca of our time, it is not yours nor mine. Your mother tongue is Chinese, Mandarin. Really, you have crossed borders. Borders of language, borders of places to live, and also borders of different fields in theology. And that really takes great courage. We praise you for doing that. Your pilgrimage has brought you here, and today you received the title of doctor. You have written a study on a topic where the relation between doctrine and Bible, or dogmatic, systematic theology and biblical studies, becomes vital and vibrant. The question of scientia media, middle knowledge. Your topic fits extremely well in the debate that even was at the heart of the debates in the beginning of the Reformation, namely the place of God's grace over against the human freedom and the sovereignty of God's grace. In several respects, your research is interesting also for the contemporary debate within Reformed theology and also in this faculty. So you have really given us an opportunity and a reason to continue the debates that were going on between you and our colleagues here. First of all, your research is typical Reformed, that it addresses the question of the role of the Bible in our theology. The Reformation has started as an attempt to achieve dominance of the Bible and the biblical message over against human thoughts and inventions. Your research shows in its own way how dominant human reflection can be over against the biblical narrative and how we have to deal with that. It is difficult, if not impossible, to free us in our reading from all kinds of accepted suppositions. Even for Bavinck may be asked whether he indeed worked as unilaterally from scripture or theological and philosophical reflection as he claims, or whether in fact there is a two traffic going on here. By using the canonical and hermeneutical insights of Brevet Childs and Anthony Thistleton, you have made an attempt to approach the biblical text in a way that is more fitting for what these texts want to say. Many texts that are used or referred to are not meant to say something on God's knowledge as such, as you say, but they have to be interpreted within the context of God as the one who is able and willing to save people and this world. It is not on power as such, but on his benevolent power and action. The debate on God's grace and power in relation to human freedom has a long history and is particularly done in the last decades by using analytical methods. Your work fits well in the longer tradition in the faculty of theology in this VU University, in the tradition of G.C. Berkouwer. We have to look for the scope of biblical texts, and only then, by careful listening to the message of the gospel, we will be able to grasp a bit of God's grace, his mightiness, and sovereignty. And thus, your work is a brave attempt to build a bridge between biblical and dogmatics, biblical studies and dogmatics in the first place. And secondly, you have shown that also the problem of God's grace and human freedom must be brought under the discipline of biblical understanding. You conclude that Molina's theory of middle knowledge does not stand on firm biblical ground. In that respect, you take side with the Dominicans and Herman Bavinck, but at the same time you emphasize that our reflection on the knowledge of God must take place within the overall biblical theological account of God who redeems. Sisi. Also, on behalf of my colleague, Professor Gijsbert van der Brink, I want to say that it was really a pleasure to work with you. You were always willing to listen. You were, so to say, teachable. And that has really contributed to the quality of your work as proof of your academic proficiency. The institution where you teach in Malaysia, the Bible College, can be proud of you. And your family, and Po, can be proud of you. And of course, we also include in our congratulations your husband, Po Singh, who we expect someday also standing on this stage. We wish you well on your further journey back to Malaysia. May the Lord bless you, your work, and all those who will be blessed by biblical teaching. And for today, let it be a joyful day, a day of celebration. Congratulations.
Dr. Chiew, I have pleasure in congratulating you also on behalf of the College of Deans of this university. And may your new title of doctor contribute to your service to academia, to the church, and to the broader world and society. I also congratulate your husband, Po, and all sympathizers who are with you today on this wonderful occasion. The doctoral examination ceremony is now completed, and Dr. Chiew will now lead the procession out of this hall, and I invite you all to follow. But before that, I should now like to close this public session of the Doctoral Examination Committee of the Faculty of Theology by pronouncing the doxology. You may stand. The name of the Lord is now to be praised and forever.
You were the Word at the beginning, one with God the Lord Most High. Your hidden glory in creation, now revealed in you, our Christ. What a beautiful name it is. What a beautiful